Hi stamping friends, welcome to Melissa's Crafting Treehouse. In this video you'll learn how to create a simple yet elegant card that combines heat embossing and dry embossing and does not use any stamped images. This is a club and free card kit project and it features the Parisian Flourish 3D embossing folder. This embossing folder is also part of the Parisian Blossoms product suite, which includes a wide range of products including stamps, dies, embellishments, and designer series paper. So we're going to start with the focal piece on this card, and I'm starting with a piece of Blueberry Bushel cardstock. Now I did create this card in two different color schemes, so I'll be showing you that in a bit. So for my first step, I'm going to take my Versamark ink pad and put ink on one side of the embossing folder. Now I am putting it on the side that has the Stampin' Up! Logo on it. You can see that down there at the bottom. And it's important that you put it on the right side based upon where you want your Versamark and consequently your heat embossing to be. So now I'm positioning my focal piece at the bottom of the embossing folder because that's the portion of the folder that I want to show up for my focal element. And I've put it up against the side that doesn't have Versamark on it so I can get it into place before it touches the Versamark. And I've shut the embossing folder to create my sandwich. And now I'm positioning it in my Big Shot, and I've put the spine of the embossing folder so that it's going in first. That is an important detail because if you don't do that, you put stress on the embossing folder and you can actually break the spine of the folder itself. So now I'm going to take my piece out of the embossing folder, and you may be able to tell that the recessed portions of the cardstock are actually a little bit darker. That's because that's where the Versamark is. The Versamark, if you stamp with it, creates a watermark element or a sort of darker shade of the same color. So that's what I've done here on this embossing folder. Now I'm putting my piece of cardstock into my silver embossing powder and tapping off the excess. And now you do want to make sure that you've tapped off as much of the embossing powder as you can, just because you do want to have some of the Blueberry Bushel cardstock showing. Now incidentally, you can use your finger just to rub off any excess powder in places where you don't want it to be. And that's what I'm doing here. I noticed that there was quite a bit of the embossing powder on the raised surfaces. And because I want that portion to show, I'm gently rubbing it to remove that excess powder. So next I'm going to take my focal piece and heat it using my heat tool. And so that you can really appreciate and see the heat embossing here, I'm going to speed up the camera so you can just watch it change and transform before your eyes. Next I'm going to do a few little refinements on my focal piece, starting with some sandpaper. This is a fine sandpaper. I think it's 100 grit. And I'm just going to sand over the surfaces to remove any specks of silver embossing powder that may have gotten onto the raised portions of my dry embossed piece. This will also distress those areas as well, giving it a little bit more of an antiqued sort of look. Next I'm going to use my Blueberry Bushel ink and a sponge to sponge over select spots on the exposed Blueberry Bushel cardstock. Now I don't want to cover the whole surface, but I'm just trying to create some highs and lows in the Blueberry Bushel color to create some variation in texture and dimension on my focal piece. Last but not least, I'm going to use some jet black StazOn with my direct to paper technique and just rub a little bit of black in a few select spots, again to create a little bit of variation in the color on the exposed Blueberry Bushel elements. And then I'm taking my black StazOn and rubbing it against the edge of my focal piece to create a bit of a frame. And you can adjust your color by adding a little bit more Blueberry Bushel in if you like. And just rub off the excess to Make sure you don't have ink on the areas that are heat embossed. Because heat embossing resists the ink, it will just sit there on the surface. So this just kind of cleans it up a little bit. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I did create 2 different color variations for this project. So this second one is done with Pretty Peacock, and I experimented with doing something a little bit different on this one that I wanted to share. So on this one I decided to put Versamark on both sides of the embossing folder just to see how it would look on the other side. So I heat embossed on both sides just to make sure that I didn't prefer having the heat embossing on the scrolly portions instead of on the flat background portions of the embossing folder. For this Pretty Peacock version, I chose to use copper embossing powder instead of the silver. I felt like the warm tones of the copper would look better with the greenish hues of the Pretty Peacock. So as you can see here, I'm putting embossing powder on the first side, and then I'm going to turn it over and put embossing powder on the second side, being careful to hold the edges of the cardstock since I've got embossing powder on both sides. And then I'm tapping off the excess, and I'm going to go ahead and heat it. Now when I heat it on one side, it will at least partially also melt it on the second side. And just like with the first version, I'm using my finger to rub off any excess and expose the raised surfaces. And then I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss. So after I did my heat embossing, I did all the same steps, but did them on both sides of this Pretty Peacock piece. So I did my sanding with the sandpaper, some sponging with Pretty Peacock ink, and then I went over it with a little bit of the Jet Black StazOn. Now in the end, I decided to use the same side as I did for the first card. If you make this project yourself, you might decide to use the other side. So now you have some idea of what it might look like. So now I'm just going to set aside the focal piece and work on the rest of the card. So next I'm bringing in my Big Shot again because I'm going to dry emboss one additional layer for this card. I'm using the Brick and Mortar embossing folder, as you can see right there. And I'm just putting my piece of cardstock in so it's oriented in the landscape orientation. And I'm going to run it through the Big Shot. Now I love this embossing folder, and I really wanted the shape and texture of those bricks to show up in behind the focal piece. So I'm using some Jet Black StazOn ink with a sponge to sponge the top and bottom of this dry embossed piece. Now I'm only doing the top and bottom because those are the only portions that will be exposed after I attach my focal piece. Now all I've got left to do is attach all my pieces together, and my card is done. Now I didn't use any Stampin' Dimensionals anywhere on this card, so I've simply attached my Blueberry Bushel brick embossed piece to a basic black card body that measures 5.5 by 8.5 before it's folded. That's a standard A2 size card. And then I've attached my focal piece to a piece of basic black cardstock, and then just centered that on the front, top to bottom. I hope you've enjoyed my project today. If you'd like dimensions or a supply list, you can find that in my blog post. There's a link in the video description below. As a reminder, this is one of my club and free card kit projects. Click on the link in the video description to learn how you can get free card kits. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, share it with friends, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for joining me today, and happy crafting!